Всім привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна, а зі мною традиційно
Наталка Гуменюк. Привіт! І сьогодні ми продовжуємо розмову про наслідки виборів у Сполучених Штатах. Ми говорили з тобою про речі такі дуже оперативні, велику кількість епізодів про це зробили, але зараз вже можливість трошечки відрефлексувати. Я мала змогу доїхати до Вашингтона. Це розмова з американським журналістом, автором видання The Atlantic Френком Фоером.
Ми все-таки з сильним новинним бекграундом так чи інакше чіпляємось за новинні приводи. Нещодавно відбулась зустріч президента Зеленського і обраного президента Трампа у Франції, і Макрона також. Тому всі розмови і думки наші точаться, в тому числі довкола планів переговорів, планів перемоги, чи то мирних планів, як би вони не називалися. Але давай повернемось до твого співрозмовника. Ти не вперше з ним спілкуєшся. Френк Фоер – один з ключових твоїх співрозмовників під час американських кампаній. Я нагадаю, що Френк Фоер – це американський публіцист і автор свого часу відомого розслідування про Пола Манафорта, голову передвиборчого штабу свого часу Януковича і його консультанта, який був заарештований в США. Френк дуже добре розуміється на підґрунті нинішніх стосунків між адміністрацією Зеленського і адміністрацією Трампа, а тоді першого зразка. А нині, скажи мені, чи ви більше фокусувалися на внутрішній американській політиці і на адміністрації Трампа, чи також все-таки говорили і про Україну?
Френк, власне, є таким одним з ключових політичних кореспондентів видання The Atlantic. Він буде тим кореспондентом, якого журнал прийшле писати профайл Зеленського, коли той переміг на виборах, коли була вся справа дійсно з імпічментом, з Манафортом, але ми не приховуємо. Видання The Atlantic відверто підтримало Камалу Гарріс і мало дуже гарні зв'язки саме з Демократичною партією. Я маю це пояснити, що останні 4 роки Френк фактично багато працював з американським істеблішментом і командою Байдена, зокрема. Він півроку провів в команді Блінкена, розповідаючи про врегулювання конфлікту на Близькому Сході, але він, можна сказати, в чомусь такий журналіст-інсайдер, трошки іншого рівня. Тому, звісно, я мала це перше запитання розповісти, так, а що з демократами, що там Байден, що Байден зараз робить для України, чи визнали вони свої помилки. Ми говорили про і політику Байдена по відношенню до України, де щось було не зроблено, де є те, про що ми всі говоримо про певну нерішучість, так, як вона рефлексується зараз, що може зробити ця адміністрація в цей час. І, звісно, про Трампа, але я насамперед ставила питання і про команду Трампа, про людей, якими вони є, хто ці люди. Але питання України для мене також було ключовим. Френк, тут є маленький спойлер, як людина, яка довго слідкує, все, можна сказати так, всередині за цією політикою, все-таки наполягає, що в Трампа є це захоплення Володимиром Путіним, яке чомусь, можливо, навіть ірраціональне. Тому ми говорили про це. Але ще одна тема, яку я підняла, одна з книжок Фоера, яка мене колись дуже сильно вразила, називається «Світ без розуму. Екзистенційна загроза великих технологій». Це книга, яку він видав в 17-му році, але почав писати ще 10 років тому, про Силіконову долину, про людей Силіконової долини. Коли він був редактором видання New Republic, тоді цим виданням на якийсь час володів один з засновників Фейсбуку Кріс Х'юк. І Френк ще тоді почав писати про те, який ризик для політики, для всього становлять люди такі, як Джеф Безос, власник Амазона. І, власне, ти розумієш, що я веду зараз, підводжу до того, що, звісно, я з нього питала про Ілона Маска, про Силіконову долину, про їхні захоплення, про що це все означає, що це за таке захоплення Маском Росії і певних таких речей. Тому мені ці речі теж було його запитати, бо він все-таки як ви вже зрозуміли, пише такі дуже детальні речі з величезним рівнем доступу.
Тобто адміністрація Трампа, стосунки Україна-США і Байден і його, скажімо так, кроки, які ще можна зробити до інавгурації Трампа, і Силіконова долина. Дуже цікава підбірка, реально дуже цікаво послухати.
Я хочу додати, бо зараз, напевно, це додати логічніше. Звісно, я провела кілька днів в Вашингтоні і говорила не тільки з Френком, що в нас подкаст має жити вічно, я думаю, що він буде жити довше, але ми дійсно знаходимося в моменті цих переговорів. Напевно, важливо, що додати, спілкуючись із Френком і з іншими людьми зараз, я не хочу нікого заспокоювати, але от пам'ятаєш, я попереджала про те, що буде дуже багато якихось витоків, ще якихось речей. І от зараз треба розуміти, був Андрій Єрмак в Вашингтоні в той день, коли я там була. Він зустрічався з JD Венсом, з Майклом Волцем. Поїхав Зеленський в Париж, там зустрівся з Трампом. Всі ці дні, звісно, я питала людей, що? Ми можемо говорити. Зараз Україна поки розповідає свою позицію того, що відбувається. Говорить, доносить, які українські погляди. Предмету розмови про конкретні поступки він ще дуже далеко не обговорюється. Тобто на цьому етапі є інформація. Команда Трампа дізнається реальні речі, щоб робити якісь речі. Але для цього вони поки на етапі отримання інформації від України, зокрема. І тому от зараз там частковий вступ НАТО, там якісь території. Про це поки, наскільки я можу сказати з людьми, які там знають трошки більше, цих розмов для них ще рано. От це я просто б хотіла, щоб зняти якусь певну таку мішуру.
І треба все-таки розуміти, що і повноважень поки що в Трампа вести такі розмови немає наразі. Дякую, мені здається, це дуже важливе доповнення. Слухай, давай ще розкажемо один цікавий факт про походження Френка Фоера, про його родину і чим вони пов'язані з Україною.
Ця країна йому не байдужа, і він бував там в іншій іпостасі раніше. Це доволі відома родина в Сполучених Штатів. Брат Френка є Джонатан Сафран Фоер, письменник, відомий. Його перша книжка «Все ясно. Everything is Illuminated» була екранізована в фільмі, де грав роль Елайджа Вуд і Гуць про єврея, який приїжджає в Україну шукати там рідний штетель. Так, це дуже гарна книжка, дуже гарний фільм. Потім він є автором книжки, на основі якої було також зроблено одноіменний фільм «Страшенно голосно і неймовірно близько» про трагедію 11 вересня, але звідки ця історія? І Френк тут якби теж до чого? Це історія дійсно їхньої родини. Їхня мати Естер Фоер, вона також письменниця. Вона є засновницею такої дуже відомої фундації в Вашингтоні, зокрема, з 6-ї синагоги, де там проводяться різні заходи, де, скажімо, там співає Адель і все таке, але історія родини в тому, що це родина виживших в Голокості, але батько матері Фоера, дідусь, покінчив життя самогубством дуже рано, в 50-х роках. І про його історію родини, саме про Голокост, про якісь рідні його краї, було дуже мало відомо. Це була велика травма. Бабуся взагалі не хотіла ніколи говорити про Україну, про Польщу, про Голокост. Взагалі це було табу в родині. І ось потихеньку їхня родина в 90-ті і в 2000-ті, не говорячи про це бабусі, почала їздити в Україну, щоб шукати в оцих українських містечках на Західній Україні інформацію про свого маминого батька, дідуся. Френк супроводжував маму.
Він звідти був родом, да? Тобто він з України родом.
Він з України родом, але дуже мало про нього було відомо. Це треба розуміти, що є журналісти, які приїхали в Україну там писати про Манафорта, а Френк з мамою в 90-х, 2000-х приїжджав по селам Західної України шукати історію, взагалі будь-які знахідки, хто пам'ятає, чи існує цей штетель, чи не існує. Це доволі детально описано, да, це не стосувалося ніяк нашої цієї розмови, але я маю на увазі, що це важливо зрозуміти, що людина дуже добре знає, для неї це не чуже місце, і при тому вона має перспективу того, яка була ця країна в 90-х, 2000-х, де вона є зараз. І він приїжджав після повномасштабного вторгнення, робив великий матеріал про злочини росіян в Бучі. Він, коли говорить про якісь рішення питань щодо України, так, звісно, ми йому не байдужі, скажімо так.
Окей, супер. Мені здається, надзвичайно багато цікавого ми вже розказали, тож я більше не буду забирати час. Давайте слухати розмову Наталки Гуменюк з Френком Фоером, американським публіцистом.
So, Frank, we met before the elections. You're a journalist, so it's not like you have a political stand, but honestly, The Atlantic kind of clearly supported Kamala, and you, for the last years, covered a lot of like the politics from Democrats. You spent time with Blinken. You were writing about Biden so much. You knew everything kind of them. You'll be the person I'll ask about them. So what's going on? How did they accept what had happened? Did they really understand what mistake they did? How are they? How are the Democrats?
It's interesting that in the last couple days, it's become clear that the people who were running Kamala's campaign understood that she was going to lose. And then they created this kind of very cheerful impression for everybody else that it was a very close campaign. But they had their own numbers. They had their own sense of things. And they could see that it wasn't going well. They did a very good job of keeping from the media, keeping from the rest of the Democratic establishment. I think that there's a lot of resignation. That in the end, it was kind of, I think Democrats had a sense that deep down, that Trump has this power over people. And that it's interesting, like there's not as many recriminations this time as I've seen in the past. It's not like 2016 where you had two clear camps that were beating each other up, trying to blame the other side for what had happened during the election. This time, there's just more resignation. Like this terrible thing happened. Biden, there were all these mistakes that were made. Biden didn't step aside at the time. They gave the nomination to Kamala Harris because it was too late to do anything else. Shit happened.
By the way, Biden himself, what is known? Because like now everybody's saying like he didn't step up in time.
We saw this last week. He pardoned his son, Hunter Biden. I think that Biden became very cut off from the rest of the world, that he was surrounded by his family and a couple of advisors who you would call dead enders, who just like, they all believe that Biden would have done better against Trump, which is ludicrous. There's no way that Biden would have done better against Trump because people understood that he's too old to be president again. I think Biden himself may feel a little bit vindicated, which is perverse.
I would right away ask you, because I think like 4 years ago during the last campaign, Hunter's Biden thing was so big, but it was about Ukraine. This is about something else. How would you really see this pardoning of his son? And like probably would remind for what he was charged.
His son was prosecuted, and I think his son was prosecuted in a way where if his last name wasn't Hunter Biden and his father wasn't a candidate for president or president of the United States, I think the prosecutors would have let it drop, really, because the charges aren't that significant. So there's one charge, which is that he lied on an application to buy guns. He lied about his drug abuse. And the other was that he didn't pay his taxes. And so he actually ended up paying his taxes. And in a normal procedure, this would have all disappeared. But there was so much pressure on the case and so much pressure to make it look like the government was doing everything above board. They just kept, but this is what happens, right? Like if you have a famous name, you're going to get more attention. Biden was somebody who claimed that he was a defender of American institutions and that he was going to do everything by the book. As it happens, his son was prosecuted by the book. Technically, the prosecutors did everything right. There's this arbitrary part of our criminal justice system where sometimes when something's not a very big deal, we let it drop. And that's what normally happens. But he did break the law. And so Biden says that he's going to defend the system. And then he pardons his son, which shows that there's two different justice systems. There's one for the famous and well-connected, and there's one for everybody else. This requires us to hold two different thoughts in our heads at the same time. One, Hunter Biden was treated differently by prosecutors, and two, Hunter Biden was treated differently by his father, who gave him his pardon. And the fact that he gave him his pardon, I think, is probably the worst of the offenses, because it just gives this sense that the system doesn't work anymore, that there's no reason for people to expect that they're going to get treated fairly by the justice system in a Trump administration, which is what Hunter Biden was claiming. He was claiming that Trump was going to go after him unfairly. And that's why Biden ostensibly gave him the pardon. But I think it's just like giving up on the system. And I think all of those things, the message it sends to people, the failure to defend institutions, I think are terrible. I think it really does. It's the last black mark on the Biden presidency.
So what does this administration know? What they're trying to accomplish before the inauguration? Do they want to, vote for some things, use some money, preserve something? What are their moves?
I think he would like to get a hostage deal in Gaza. And I think that's possible because Trump wants a hostage deal in Gaza before he comes to office. He'd rather not have to deal with it himself. And so I think the Israelis at least feel some pressure right now for that to happen. I think he wants to get as many arms to Ukraine as possible, because he worries that won't happen after January 20th. I think they may end up pardoning more people, because they will certainly pardon more people. But I think there's a chance that he may try to do something dramatic with presidential pardons that makes the Hunter Biden pardon seem like a drop in the bucket. So they could maybe pardon a bunch of people who were arrested for drug crimes that were stupid for just owning marijuana, or that he could preemptively pardon a lot of people who Trump might prosecute. So like Anthony Fauci or Hillary Clinton, who knows? I mean, who they've put on a list like that. But they're people that Trump's talked about prosecuting, and he could just try to preemptively protect them. But there's not a whole lot else.
So since you already mentioned the support to Ukraine, there are a bit different questions. When I talk now, being back home to Ukraine, people were saying like, we had hopes, but Biden was undecisive. With NATO invitation, with particular permissions not making it before. And it was clear that a week or 2 weeks before the elections, nothing like that would happen, because they didn't want to provoke Putin. I'm using these quote marks about provoking Putin, as if Putin invents provocations himself. I would really ask your take. Was like, and now you kind of feel like he could do so much more earlier. He was like always a bit like undecisive and hesitant. It was not so clear because there was still hope that maybe later, and it didn't happen.
When you look at the first 2 years, you have a different picture than when you look at the last 2 years. And it's not just Ukraine. I think you could look at the way that he dealt with China, the way that he dealt with Netanyahu, and you'd say he was reluctant always to insert himself decisively into conflict. So there was weakness there. And it was weakness when China started to hack all of our telecommunication systems and there was no price to be paid. There was weakness when Netanyahu would just, tell him one thing and then embarrass him the next week by ignoring him. With Iran, there was never any consequences. Iran was breaking sanctions and they never tried to tighten up sanctions or to put more pressure on Iran. I think the same is true with Ukraine, where he started off, he did take risks along the way, but he was always so afraid about crossing an imaginary line. And nobody knew where that imaginary line existed. And he just didn't try to test it even along the way. Because it's art, not science. Nobody knows what Putin's reaction will be to anything, right? But you have to test it along the way. And he kept imagining how Putin would respond to various things as opposed to gathering some data about how Putin would do. And so he was making himself weaker than he needed to be constantly.
So just to also finish with this topic of the international politics, we didn't have proper time to follow the Israel and Gaza and Ukraine, like to the details. But you did this report, you follow Antony Blinken in his deals with Netanyahu. Could you really explain what actually the Democrats were doing, what they were trying to accomplish and what didn't work?
So I embedded myself really with the State Department, the National Security Council, and tried to track all of the inside the room diplomacy as it related to Gaza. I think what you see is that this kind of imagined sense that the Americans had about when the war would end based on promises that they got from the Israelis. They thought that the war would have been over almost a year ago. And then the war kept going on, and they kept applying pressure on the Israelis to do certain things to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza. They were very worried about the escalation of a regional war, and they always were convinced that they were getting closer and closer to a hostage deal, which never happened. And it's not just Netanyahu's fault. Hamas was a terrible negotiating partner, that they would withdraw from negotiations at various moments when it looked like they were close to a deal. And I think there's a lot of blame that gets unfairly cast unilaterally on Netanyahu, and people forget that Hamas is like an actor in this war who could surrender or release hostages at any moment. But the whole experience was basically a failure for the Biden administration because they set out a number of very, very clear goals and objectives that they hoped to accomplish, and they invested incredible amounts of resources and diplomatic energy in trying to achieve them. And none of them really came to fruition.
What did they reach now? What is that? That like kind of deal in Lebanon, and like is like Trump trying to get a credit for that already?
Trump definitely scares Iran. Israel attacked Iran, and Iran promised that it would respond, and Iran hasn't responded. Iran could have told Hezbollah that they needed to keep up the fighting. I mean, I think it's mostly that the Israelis were able to surprise Hezbollah by blowing up their pagers and then preemptively attacking them and killing all of their leadership. And that actually had the effect of basically pressuring Hezbollah in the end to understand that they need, in order to protect Hezbollah's place within Lebanese political system, they needed to end the war.
Now, coming to Trump, you were one of the first reporters, if not the first, to make the good profile of Paul Manafort and to work on that story. I was a previous Trump team, so you kind of follow the previous Trump team a lot. There is kind of clarity today that that team was chaotic. It took some time for Trump to gather various people who didn't get along together. Many of them had left by the end of his term. Now, a lot of people saying that it's very well-prepared team, quite kind of more MAGA than you think it could be. What can you say, the difference? Because, like, we discussed Bannon, we discussed Manafort. They didn't, there was no any kind of positive discussion about them. But now it looks like, oh no, that was kind of okay team. It was Bolton there. And now we have real weird people.
Nobody expected Donald Trump to win in 2016. And so there was almost no preparation for his presidency. This time, it seemed like for a couple years, there was a good chance that he could win. And so there were all these other forces in the world that started to coalesce around Donald Trump to try to shape his presidency in order to achieve their objectives. You have a lot of conservative right-wing libertarians who understood that Trump could be a way to destroy the federal government for generations by putting the right people in the right places and by writing the right orders to destroy departments or to change the way the departments functioned. So they attached themselves to the Trump team. You have a lot of rich people in Wall Street and in Silicon Valley who saw that if they attached themselves to Trump, they could achieve a lot of their objectives. And then you have all of these other people who were diehard MAGA. During the campaign, the term that they used was weirdos. The Democrats used were weirdos to describe them. And so you have a lot of weirdos who are still there in Trump's orbit. Sebastian Gorka, who's a weirdo, who's a Hungarian fascist, who is now the deputy national security advisor. You've got the Secretary of Defense is a Fox News host who wears crusader tattoos and who goes to a church that's Christian nationalist and who's got this record of being an alcoholic. You've got the director of the FBI is going to be Kash Patel, who is like the ultimate Trump loyalist, who's a guy who couldn't get a top job anywhere in any other organization, but because he played the Trump universe in the correct sort of way and demonstrated his loyalty to Trump in an undying fashion, now is in charge of the most powerful domestic law enforcement agency in the land. So yes, Steve Bannon's not there, Paul Manafort's not there, but there are a lot of people from the old kind of super chaotic, crazy Trump land who were there, as well as, people who understand exactly who Trump is and exactly how his mind functions, who are trying to exploit the opportunity.
What I'm kind of warned here is that for Trump, domestic politics matters the most, and a lot of effort would be really into destroying federal system, destroying the institutions. In Ukraine, things, of course, look differently. And I think for everybody in the world, you just like, oh, Trump said that about South Korea. He said that about Iran. Everybody's guessing what he's saying about each country. And of course, about his ideas of and some admiration of Putin. We really think that he'll try to talk to Putin. He'll do that. But it would be probably a smaller issue for them rather than the whole inner thing. Of course, it looks differently from Ukraine because it's just such a dramatic change. It's kind of an important thing. There are so many talks about these negotiations. There is little substance in that. There are so many speculations. You're guessing by bio of every single person, which is kind of offered to get the position, what he used to say about Ukraine. 5 years ago, he said this, so he's a good guy. But no, now he says this, and probably he's in a different camp. What do you see? Because some of these people are hawkish, but they're also changing their loyalties. They speak a bit differently.
It's hard to say he cares about anything, but I think he does care about this. I think that he doesn't hate Zelenskyy maybe in the way that he used to hate Zelenskyy and blame him for a lot of things. But the admiration for Putin is real, and Trump genuinely believes in his capacity to make deals himself. And he genuinely believes that NATO is not a great thing and that we need to change America's footprint in the world. And so he's not going to make it a priority, I don't think, unless he sees an opportunity. It seems pretty clear he's not going to be committed to funding the war in the way that the Biden administration was. He's not committed to NATO in the way that Biden was. His desire to get victories, to get points on the board, to put together deals is a real thing. So I don't think any of it really bodes very well for Ukraine. I don't think there's any way to paint a pretty picture. But I think you could say that maybe he's not going to come in tomorrow and insist that Zelenskyy cut the worst possible deal with Putin. I don't think that that's going to happen, but maybe in a couple months' time, it could happen.
So I heard already in the town a couple of other different things. So from the people who are critical to Trump, very critical to Trump, they would say that they heard from some negotiations that Trump really mentioned that he doesn't really want Ukraine to fail dramatically, just because it's about him, which is a positive sign. I also had a chance shortly to talk to Fiona Hill. So obviously I asked this question and we kind of also agreed that it's all about unpredictability. Yet, Trump is fascinated with Putin and kind of we don't see the way how he would persuade Putin. It's like it's in his mind. So he might kind of blame Ukraine for not getting this deal. It doesn't look very positive. But what would you say about the people around him as well? You said Gorka, a strange guy, but hawkish. But what my observation is, it's my private professional but private observation for the last years, that it's not any longer these kind of Cold War Republicans. There are these people who really are not into the mood of the Cold War. Russia, they are sympathetic to Russia. When I was in 2012, the heritage people would always tell me, the Republicans are better for Eastern Europe. And now it's clearly different because MAGA people, they kind of worshipping Russia for their traditional values, all kind of things. So I hate guessing. I'm very tired after this month. I'm guessing, I'm asked, but I'm still asking you to do the kind of thing. Maybe
I'm terrible at giving you predictions. I think I predicted to you that Harris was going to win the election. So discount everything that I'm about to say. But I think that the system itself has tension within it, that you do have everything that you just described, the MAGA America Firsters who worship Putin. They exist within the administration. But then you hire Keith Kellogg to be the envoy, and he clearly has a different position. Marco Rubio clearly has a different position. So there's tension within the system. And that means that the system will resolve itself by Donald Trump kind of pushing it one way or the other. We know in his heart which way he would push it. There's just not really a question to me that he likes Putin and he's not sympathetic to Ukraine. But on the other hand, for him to make a dramatic intervention, he has to decide that it's something that he cares enough about to focus on.
Where is JD Vance? Is he kind of present? Because we hear the least from him.
It's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. It was so big before, but now it's I hear all this kind of strange people, new people.
Who knows? I mean, I think that the relationship between a president and vice president is something that needs to work itself over time. But Trump is not the type of guy who leans on a vice president, even if he picked somebody who was James Baker as his vice president, who was impressive and substantive. I don't think that he would rely on them in any sort of great way.
So, The World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. That's a book you wrote, which was published in 2017. So you kind of were before that. It was almost 10 years ago. A fascinating book. I really loved it. And, you really were warning about influence of the big tech for the media, for, the people like Bezos, and how Amazon is kind of controlling so many things, and how publishers would be freaking out to do something about the Amazon. You worked with the people who founded Facebook and explained their mind. Here we are with Elon Musk being kind of number two. What it is.
Yeah. You know what's so interesting? The thing that I think about most now is the way in which Silicon Valley's relationship to Trump is part of an oligarchical system, and I can't help but draw lessons from Ukraine in the way that Ukraine works, in the way in which you have this symbiosis.
We even used to have it.
Yeah. God willing, we don't have a war that is required to break our oligarchical system. But the way in which you have, Trump, Musk and Bezos, they own media, and they need the government to give them money in order for them to fulfill their dreams. And the dreams that Musk and Bezos have are about going to Mars and creating space colonies. And the only entity that has enough money to be able to fund that is the U.S. government. And so they want to develop this relationship with Trump where they're willing to make certain concessions in order to stay in his good graces, in order to get that money. I mean, Musk is sitting in a totally different sort of situation. I'm trying to think with Yanukovych, who would have been the oligarch, who would have been Akhmetov. Yeah, exactly. He's the Akhmetov of this administration. He's in the office. He can get whatever deal that he wants. He's able to get the people appointed that he wants. He financed his campaign in the way that Akhmetov financed Yanukovych's campaign. He ran the ground operation. That's what Akhmetov did, right? That's the way you need to understand. But what's different is that the Silicon Valley guys don't just want to get rich. They're already so rich, but they have these bigger dreams that they want to fulfill, like space colonization, or being able to get cryptocurrency to replace the US dollar, or being able to let artificial intelligence run wild, because that's the way that they have power, is that they can kind of replace government by replacing these systems with themselves.
Would you explain also them, being, following your book, what is this beyond grandiose ideas. What is that? What is this mindset of the Silicon Valley? And I would explain that, Zuckerberg, as I understood, he was on the other side. He was supporting Kamala, some other people in the Silicon Valley as well.
Not Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg called up Trump after his assassination and told him that he was awesome. And then Zuckerberg has been going to Mar-a-Lago. He went to Mar-a-Lago and had dinner with him and met with him. He's trying to get on his good side. And Jeff Bezos obviously is trying to get on his good side, which is why he canceled the Washington Post endorsement of Kamala Harris and has been tweeting things and giving public statements very supportive of Trump. But it is interesting because they flipped. Like Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post and turned it into a resistance newspaper. Democracy dies in the darkness was its motto. And now he's gone in the opposite direction. He understood that resistance was bad for his business. It was bad for him personally because Trump made him a target. And so the easier thing for him to do is to accommodate himself to Trump. He would like to be part of Trump's oligarchical circle.
So beyond this kind of money for funding and these incredible ideas, these people think that they run the world, they think that they are, I do think that they think that they're hybrid, they're different people, they're enlightened, yet they know technology. There are these people who don't know technology, and they are the ones who knew the future.
Well, I mean, it's like with Elon Musk, he thinks of himself kind of as an Ubermensch who has, who needs to have as many babies as possible. I mean, it's like there's something, but I think that the arrogance and the hubris is incredibly important to it all. I think it is a quest to kind of achieve power, to replace the government with themselves. And then I do think the utopian dreams that underlie technology are things that they invented because they invented these systems. They believe in the idea of the singularity, that there's a moment where computers and human beings are going to merge, and that we're just at the dawn of that age because artificial intelligence is just starting to hit these important milestones on the route to the singularity. And so they see government potentially as an obstacle to that government could regulate and prevent them from achieving that dream. Government could break up some of their companies, which even Trump might do. And this is part of the game that they're going to play.
So what's bad about that?
So here's the game. Elon Musk will use the government to punish his competitors. So OpenAI is his competitor. They could get regulated in such a way, or they could get punished by the government that just creates opportunities for Elon Musk. One company may hate Google, and so they'll champion the government attacking Google. Elon Musk doesn't like that some of the American car companies get subsidies for the government for electric vehicles, and Tesla doesn't. And so rather than get subsidies for himself, what he wants to do is get the subsidies taken away from his competitors so they can't develop into effective challengers.
I'm kind of still asking you to more explain, returning to the title of your book. So what is kind of wrong with this algorithm? What is your kind of main, let's say, thesis of what something you were also arguing? What are you warning us?
I was trying to warn that in essence, the big thing is that you have technology that looks like it's liberating, that it's going to break up systems of power, it's going to create opportunities for people. But in the end, it's the people who run those systems who become more powerful, and they claim to hate elites, and so they hate media, and they want to make it as convenient as possible for people to get information. But really, the systems that they create are incredibly susceptible to either manipulation, or they end up being systems that are antithetical to critical thinking. And I think I look at this last campaign and just the way in which media was so beside the point in this last campaign. It was all about social media and about things that Silicon Valley ultimately has control over. And people got such terrible information. And I think you probably saw this when you were out in the field, that people were stuck in filter bubbles where they were getting highly manipulated information. And that meant that their views of the world were just kind of cockamamie.
Yeah, it's like, for instance, I was very much interested in this phenomenon that, like the Palestinians would get kind of like the stories about Kamala, where she would be supporting of Israel, Jews would be targeted with kind of some things where Democrats would kind of be pro-Palestinian, like this kind of trying to create this polarization and using the algorithm.
Exactly. And it's like, if you're stuck in a world where you're just getting fed conspiracies and you're getting fed one-sided views of the world, it means that your ability to think critically and in a reasoned and strategic sort of way about the issues you care about is just broken.
I thought about, polarization, and I saw it myself. But, there is a level of polarization which we would say people in Tel Aviv, in Gaza, you can't bridge them. But you can bridge the other people. But if you artificially push them against each other, then that's a problem, and that's why probably observe. So there are two Americas, we can agree, but kind of they also artificially push against each other.
It's two Americas suffering from exactly the same dynamic, which is that they're just getting fed terrible information, and they exist in informational ecosystems where their own biases just get confirmed over and over again.
I'll still ask, beyond these utopian ideas of Elon Musk and libertarians, what is his fascination with Putin? No, it's quite strange when the guy says, like, I had a call with Vladimir Putin, and what he's doing, about like writing about Ukraine, like laughing on Zelenskyy. I'm kind of like, what's that? Because I remember, there was a lot of attempts to bring a lot of famous, important people to Ukraine, like a lot of them traveled. And I do remember when, Musk was considering to travel. I think I talked to Fareed Zakaria. He was there for the conference. He said, like, I was persuading him, but he said, like, I'm afraid for my life. But that was a year and a half. But since then, all the things happened with his kind of alleged call with Vladimir Putin. But now he's really literally mocking the Ukrainian president.
I can't say I totally understand it, because he was on the right side, right? He was pro-Ukrainian, and then he gets this call, and the way the Wall Street Journal reported it was that he was told there would be consequences, and he suddenly starts to back down, and we don't know anything more than that. I don't have any good theories. The one thing I think about is maybe his primary interactions with Russia have been around space. He went to Russia once to kind of try to buy rockets. I know that part of the whole idea of space colonization it involves possibly levels of cooperation that would be beneficial for creating the colonies on Mars that he's talking about creating. That's the best I can do. I don't know, but I do think you have to think about their geostrategy, which is not a conventional geostrategy. They're thinking about other things.
And still Ukrainians, what are also worried, I'm following Donald Jr. Trump Instagram since I saw him in Florida in 2020. It's crazy. But I'm used to that. Yet he's going on with that thing. Also mocking Ukrainians, being so vulgar. It's quite disgusting. I can use this term. With this guy, maybe you also can explain a bit Trump's family, because Kushner and Ivanka were important. And they were even considered to be reasonable. Now it's kind of like a bit different people. What is about this Donald? What was his son? What is his family now?
I think Donald Jr., he exists in his father's id. Like he's like Donald Trump is somebody in like the Freudian terms, like is pretty much all id, right? But he's like the id's id. He's somebody who just exists in like the most vengeful, conspiratorial part of his father's imagination, which is his way of trying to, I think, get his father's love. But he also sees that there's this very powerful political base out there that responds to this type of talk. And so he's just marinated in America First. And, he's marinated in all of the Tucker Carlson world. He put his thumb on the scale for JD Vance as vice president rather than Marco Rubio. He's the true believer when it comes to Putin-worshipping, NATO-hating foreign policy.
He wants to get father's love, but is he kind of influencing his father?
Yeah, for sure. I think so, because his father responds.
And what are the others? Like
So Jared and Ivanka seem to have disappeared because I think it was very bruising for them to go through this the first time, that they had a different idea about what the Trump presidency would get them. They thought that it would get them love and respect from elites, because that's the world that they grew up living in. Jared Kushner's father bought the most expensive building in Manhattan and wanted to be loved by the rest of Manhattan for having done that. And that's kind of what Jared grew up with. And the first Trump presidency didn't turn out that way for him. And so now his father gets to be ambassador to France. And that's his big victory in all of this.
So what are your hopes? What are you following? What would be your kind of...
Part of you wants everything to kind of go in the most reasonable way possible. You don't want Kash Patel arresting journalists. You don't want support for Ukraine to totally collapse. You don't want the tariffs to kick in because it'll make things more expensive. But then there's this other part of the brain, which is all right, well, maybe in order to expose this once and for all, you do need catastrophe.
Not in our case, not in our case.
Not in your case. But that's a terrible way of thinking as well. Nobody should be rooting for catastrophe. That's, you may not want for Trump to be successful as kind of an autocrat and a dictator, and we should root against that. But I think rooting for kind of his failure could have spectacular consequences for Ukraine, for Americans, for everybody, and it could cause a whole lot of suffering.
My final question is for somebody who kind of cares about Ukraine. You've been so many times, still years ago, you traveled, you have written a lot. So, what would be also something to say to Ukrainians, where they would be, there are so many bad things we expect. Honestly, I'm not there on the side of those who would look for silver lining or Trump's unpredictability maybe bring something kind of big and decisive. It's not exactly what I'm asking. I kind of more on human level, on kind of personal and human level for somebody who cares about the country. What would you say to the Ukrainians?
Well, I think Trump is somebody who can be susceptible to manipulation. And I think when I look at the way that Zelenskyy has tried to play Trump, I can see the ways in which he's very obviously trying to manipulate him into doing the right thing. And I think that that's not a bad strategy. I think that even if you know in your heart the guy's not on your side, it's you've still got to try to maneuver. And so I think that's admirable. But I think, in the end, it's what Ukraine has accomplished, essentially, with help from the United States, and should not discount that. Last time I was in Ukraine, it's you could see there's so much negativity towards Biden for having failed, but at the same time, Biden delivered incredible levels of support to Ukraine. It hasn't happened in very many other instances after World War II. Maybe no other instance after World War II as the United States kind of intervened in a conflict financially with arms in the way that it's intervened in this conflict. But on the other hand, it's Ukraine has done so much of this kind of on its own. And that's the thing to kind of just stand at and admire and marvel and remind yourself. It's you need weapons. The United States supplies those weapons. You can't fight a war against Russia with knives, but the fortitude and the bravery and the resolve are things that only Ukraine can supply itself.
Thank you.